Meet Me in the Moon Deck by Cam Miller. March 29th, 1972. The moon was bright and full, just like Earl said it would be. It gently hung in the cool late March air like a light bulb over the city. Frank took the hand of his wife as they emerged from the Finley Street underpass, heading to the bleacher entrance of Crosley Field. "I still don't know how you pulled this off," Mary Ann said, wrapping her arms around his. Frank smiled. "I pulled a few strings." "Now will you tell me which game we are seeing?" she asked. "I told you, my dear, it's a surprise." Mary Ann smiled, shaking her head. "I hear the games are down by the river now." "Yeah, Earl told me they have plastic grass. I can't even imagine." The couple walked up to the gate. There were dozens of no trespassing in construction zone signs plastered on the walls. Frank peeked under an authorized personnel only sign attached to the gate. The moonlight allowed him to see that the turnstiles were gone, and trash littered the walkway. He looked at his watch. "We're a little early, but I'm sure Earl knows we're here," Frank said, still peeking through the gate. Mary turned around, gazing across the street at the expressway. "It's still hard to believe everything is gone." Frank agreed, scanning the endless parking lots along Finley Street. It had been almost a decade since the west end of town had been gutted in the name of progress. Cliffs, Hulbert Hall, Peanut Jim, Frank muttered, remembering pieces of the neighborhood. "The Hubert Walking Man, the Scoreboard Cafe," Mary chimed in, nodding in the direction of their old hangout spot. "Where we wrote our song on a napkin," she grinned. Mary Ann raised her eyebrows, giving Frank a cue. He took a breath, and in unison the two began singing their song to the tune of "Meet Me in St. Louis" by Judy Garland. "Meet me in the moon deck, meet me at the park." Suddenly, a voice joined them from behind the chain-link fence. A shadow of a man appeared walking up the tunnel, his keys jangling as he opened the gate. "Don't tell me the lights aren't shining. It's baseball after dark." Frank and Mary Ann paused, smiling when they noticed it was their old friend, before continuing. "We will cheer on our home team under the lights and moonbeams. If you will meet me in the moon deck, meet me at the park." "How can you possibly remember that song?" Frank said, putting his arm around Earl. "Couldn't forget it if I wanted to," he laughed. "You kids sang it in these bleachers so many times. It's a catchy number." Earl walked up to Mary Ann, embracing her. "And you are as beautiful as ever, my good lady." "Thank you, Earl. We've missed you," Mary Ann blushed. "Now on to business," Earl said. He straightened up his jacket, adjusting his hat and horn-rimmed glasses. "Tickets, please," he said with a serious face, putting on an act of formality. Frank reached into his back pocket and pulled out 2 bleacher tickets, placing them in Earl's hand. He knew this night would likely be the last time he'd ever see his old friend. A sudden feeling of sadness overcame him. "I know," Earl whispered. "I know." He tipped his usher cap, as he often did, and shined his flashlight, leading the way toward the portal entrance. "Wow," Frank said as the moonlit field came into view. The field was overgrown with weeds. The little grass that was left was patchy and brown. Twisted metal and remnants of the grandstand were strewn across most of the infield. The once mighty 60-foot scoreboard was nothing more than a shell. Most of the seats in the grandstand were gone, and the ads on the left field wall were all but faded away. "How will they—" Mary Ann started to ask before Earl interrupted. "Ah, you'll see. It's really quite incredible. I know I never forget the first time I saw it." "We'll take your word for it," Frank said, trying to understand how any of this was possible. As they made their way to row 7, their usual spot next to the wall in right center field, Frank noticed a small black transistor radio and a scorecard in pencil sitting on the bleachers. If you'd like to follow along on the radio, just tune it to 195.4 and take it with you. There's always a game on. "Interesting, thanks," Frank said, examining the radio. "So how many games are left?" asked Mary Ann. "Well, let's see," Earl said as he pulled out a piece of paper from his inside jacket pocket, unfolding it. "The joint comes down in 3 weeks, so," Earl said, running his fingers over the paper as he softly counted. "Looks like we have 20, the last one on the 18th of April." Earl pulled out his pocket watch, holding it outward as he strained to read it. Lights come on in 10 minutes. Game is in 20. Under your seat, you'll find peanuts, Cracker Jacks, and sodas. Frank and Marianne smiled as they peeked under their bleachers. Perfect, Marianne said. Okie dokie, Artichokey. Enjoy the game. Again. Earl slipped his pocket watch back into his pocket, tipped his cap once again, and disappeared into the portal. Just like the old days, Frank said, ripping open the bag of peanuts. Has it really been 5 years? Marianne asked, opening her soft drink bottle. 5 long years, sweetheart. I'm kind of nervous, Marianne said. Frank grabbed her hand, placing it to his lips. As he kissed it, a sudden cha-chunk sound echoed through the ballpark. One by one, the 8 light stanchions that towered over the field came to life. As the lights brightened on the dilapidated park, everything started to change. The grass suddenly looked like a field in Ireland, lush and full. The infield dirt returned, smooth and perfect as the scattered debris disappeared. The scoreboard flickered on, displaying the names Redlegs and Pirates. The clock that sat atop the board spun its hands to the correct time of 8 p.m. The faded outfield ads were once again crisp and colorful. The couple stood up, staring in shock at what was transpiring before them. Frank put his hands on his forehead, and Marianne placed her hands on her chest. I don't believe this, Frank said in an almost whimper. Look, here they come, Marianne shouted as Frank turned on the radio, tuning it to 195.4 as the announcer set the stage. And here come the Redlegs as they bolt from the third base dugout, taking their positions. Bell is in center, Post in right field, Greengrass to left, Harmon at third, McMillan and Temple up the middle, Big Clue mans first, Bailey behind the dish, and Valentine toes the rubber. Their bright white uniforms and blue hats shined magnificently under the lights. Manager Tebbets was pacing in the dugout, chatting with the rest of the team. The Pirates milled around in theirs, some popping their heads out, spitting tobacco juice. As the players went through their warm-ups, the Crosley Field organ whirred into action, playing Happy Days Are Here Again. Amazing, just amazing, Marianne whispered softly. Lady and gentlemen, a voice crackled through the speakers of the PA, welcome to tonight's game between the Pirates of Pittsburgh and your Cincinnati Redlegs. Here are the lineups. Frank hastily grabbed the pencil and scorecard, scribbling in the names as the announcer read them off. He then wrote a date at the top of the page, showing it to Marianne. April 27th, 1954, she read aloud, just as the umpire yelled for play to begin. Frank placed the fallen strands of her brunette hair behind her ear. He then pulled out a newspaper clipping that he had always kept in his wallet. The headline read, Big Clue for 2. Marianne wiped her misty eyes, reading the clipping as that night came back to her. You were running late, and just so happened to be walking up Western Avenue as the game began, Frank said, recalling the events. I was on time. My girlfriend was the one that made us late, Marianne said with a smirk, correcting Frank. Roberts hits one sharply to short, and McMillan boots it. Frank groaned before writing E5 on the scorecard. After Corky Valentine got Frank Thomas to ground out to Harmon for the final out, Frank pointed to the field. And this half inning is where our story begins. Harmon led off with a ground out to shortstop. McMillan then struck out. Bell walked. Big Clue stepped to the plate. The whap. Frank and Marianne jumped to their feet as Big Clue slammed the ball over their heads and onto Western Avenue. They cheered loudly as Big Clue rounded the bases, shaking hands with Bell as he crossed the plate. Marianne raced up the bleachers and looked over the wall. Right there, Marianne shouted as she pointed, turning to Frank. I was walking right there in front of the Scoreboard Cafe. The ball rolled right up to my feet. I believe this belongs to you, a voice shouted from below. It was Earl. He tossed the ball up to Marianne, who caught it before waving back to him. Earl, thank you, thank you. Earl once again tipped his cap before walking back to the bleacher gate. Frank was grinning from ear to ear. Right place, right time. Marianne made her way back down to the 7th row, beaming as she showed Frank the ball. One more homer to go, she said. They are all so young. Just look at them, Frank said. Baseball young, Marianne responded as she repeatedly tossed her home run ball in the air. For the next few minutes, the pair sat in silence. They realized that their fate had already been determined. This game was a gift. a gift they would never receive again. They were determined to soak it all in. "How lucky are we?" Frank asked. As the bottom of the third moved along and Big Clue stepped to the plate, Frank turned up the radio. "Harmon leads off third. The pause from Surcount. The pitch. Thwap. Big Clue sends one deep. Could it be? Yes, sirree, that's another one for the Redlegs' big first baseman, as the gentleman makes a fine grab in the bleachers. It's now 5-0 Redlegs." Frank turned to Marianne, handing her the ball. "Big Clue with 2, he grinned. "I was holding up the clue ball, showing it off as I turned around," Frank remembered. "You caught my eye as you held up your clue ball." "Your friends were practically pushing you to make your way up to me," Mary said, laughing at the memory. Frank took her by the hand, and they climbed to the top row. "I'm Frank." "I'm Marianne." They put their arms around each other, and as they kissed, a warm breeze encircled them, as if it was one of the countless summer nights they had spent up on the moon deck at Crosley Field. Frank looked up at the moon, and then back into Marianne's eyes, and they once again began to recite their song. "Meet me in the moon deck, meet me at the park. Don't tell me the lights aren't shining, it's baseball after dark. We will cheer on our home team, under the lights and moonbeams. If you will meet me in the moon deck, meet me at the park." April 18th, 1972. Frank helped Marianne scale the expressway embankment facing the ballpark. Hundreds of fans just like them sat waiting to watch a 7,000-pound wrecking ball with a weeping Mr. Redlegs painted on it crash through the bleacher wall in right field. "I'm glad we decided to come," Marianne said. Frank smiled, nodding his head in agreement. But he wasn't so sure. Maybe Earl was right to not want to witness a cremation. After all, this corner had been such a big part of his life. He reminisced about those humid summer days watching Lombardi and Kraft after selling newspapers before games, and skipping class, with Earl letting him sneak in to watch the World Series in 1940. He finally recalled being in the sun deck with his Army buddies, watching Robinson and Post launch baseballs off the laundry building. And of course, meeting Marianne. She was his true love. There were a million moments and memories in that old park that helped shape and define Frank DuPont. This was a funeral. He took a deep breath and put his arm around his wife, gently kissing her forehead. Marianne squeezed Frank's hand. She knew he was only there for her. He wasn't one for goodbyes. She never had many chances to say goodbye. Her father, who took her to so many games as a child and taught her to love the game, died of a heart attack while at the bank. Her mother died of a stroke while at her hotel job, and her first husband was killed in the war. All of her goodbyes were when it was too late. In Frank, she had someone who loved the game like her. He appreciated the history, the lore, the tradition. They were a perfect match. She adored him. That's why she was glad that they died together. And she didn't have to say goodbye. The car crash and their death was instant, and a new togetherness began. The giant wrecking ball smashed into the wall, and a loud cheer went up from the people that stood behind the caution tape. Frank and Marianne couldn't understand why they were cheering. This is a funeral, Frank thought. As the demolition event ended and the crowd began to leave the site, Frank noticed a man in an usher hat leaning against the expressway guardrail. He tapped Marianne on the shoulder and nodded in the man's direction. Earl saw them. He tipped his cap, smiling a big smile before fading into the expressway traffic. "Let's see, what game should we listen to?" Frank said. He pulled the radio out of his jacket pocket, fiddling with the dial as they walked hand in hand into the shadows of the Finley Street underpass.